will obviously not be on the next exam, the exam this week, but will be on the final exam. So the final exam, just so you know, is going to be a section exam on digestive anatomy and physiology, as well as a cumulative exam. About half of it will be digestive anatomy and physiology, and about half of it will be more cumulative. Okay? So what we're doing today is going to get an overview. Oh, by the way, I will prepare a list of key concepts for this section as well, which I will give you a week from today. I didn't want to get it mixed up with the exam, so I'm just going to have it out to you after the exam. Right? Just to be clear that nothing we're talking about today is on the next exam, but everything we talk about today could be on the final exam. So we're going to do an overview of the digestive tract. We're going to start to learn about the food groups and the various mechanisms that our body uses to digest food. We'll talk about some microscopic layered structure that is going to be the common theme in every organ of the digestive tract, well, in most of the organs of the digestive tract. We'll talk about exocrinology as opposed to endocrinology. And we're going to start talking about saliva and swallowing. Deglutition is the fancy name for swallowing as the first step in digestion. So we're going to get the ball rolling. Okay, so here's an image that I Xeroxed from strangely enough, from an ad for a medicine. But it wasn't in a medical journal. It was about an ad for a cholesterol lowering drug. And so it has this cartoon of the digestive tract, which I thought was remarkable. So let's talk about what's wrong with this cartoon. I mean, there's so many things that are wrong with it. What do you see? What's wrong with it? Give me something that's wrong with it. This is fun. Marina? Did you? I thought you said something. What's that?
The digestive tract is bigger.
The digestive tract is a lot bigger than that. Okay.
There's no stomach.
There's no stomach. Right? Where's the stomach, right? There's no stomach. Yeah, Mackenzie?
There's no esophagus.
Yeah, there is an esophagus, but it starts in the middle of the chest, and you know that's not right. So where's the rest of the esophagus? Where does it start? That's something wrong with it. There's something wrong with the other end as well. What are we talking about? The digestive tract does not end in the middle of the abdomen, right? I'm not surprised that they didn't go into that detail. But so there's no stomach. The starting and the ending of the digestive tract is wrong. What else?
The shape and complexity is wrong. It's just like an S curve.
Yeah, right. The shape and complexity is completely wrong, right? There's basically no small or large intestine that you have seen in real life, so to speak. So that's wrong. What else? Yes?
Pancreas?
There's no pancreas. So there's no stomach, there's no pancreas. The liver is way too small. The gallbladder's missing. So we can start, there's no omentum, but they never show the omentum. The omentum always gets cut out. So, so now you know more than the people who drew this cartoon by a long shot. Here's another cartoon that was from this was about the microbiome. So you can see this is focusing on the bacteria that populate the intestines that Rob Dunn spoke about. So what's wrong with this one? This one's better, but what's wrong with this one? Give me something.
Is that the right curve? Is it the stomach?
Yeah, so this is the stomach. That's a reasonable cartoon of the stomach. That's not bad.
There's no accessory organs?
There's a
Outside of
liver.
the liver, yeah.
The liver, that's not a very reasonable cartoon of
Yeah.
the liver, but it's evoking the liver, but there's no pancreas. And there's no gallbladder, which wouldn't be hard to cartoon in. Yeah, Mackenzie?
It kind of looks like there's two openings to the small intestine.
Well, I think that's just two openings to the small intestine or to the large intestine. Well,
It looks like they're like
it looks like they're,
grouping
yeah,
together.
right. So we know that this tube doesn't connect here, goes into here in the small intestine, and we know that there is a connection here, the ileocecal junction between the small intestine and the large intestine. And this isn't bad, that the fact that there's sort of this thing hanging off of the ileocecal junction, that's the cecum, although it makes it look like maybe this is an exit and that we have two exit ports, and obviously we don't. So that's a little weird to cut it off there. They could have made this, you know, an inch shorter and it would have been better. What else? Everything else we could, you know, we can pick this apart. Where's the pyloric sphincter? The stomach doesn't just open up into the small intestine. There's a sphincter there. But, you know, that's what we're getting to. So here's a cartoon from your textbook, which is also a cartoon. And we could pick this one apart, but it's better. It shows the full esophagus up into the mouth, and the, you know, nasopharynx and the oropharynx. It shows the liver and the gallbladder and some of the plumbing and the stomach and the pancreas and the large and small intestine. And it goes all the way to the end. So it's better, but it's missing a few things, right? It's missing the greater omentum. It's missing the mesentery that you've seen, the mesentery that was holding the small intestine into its tight folds. Doesn't have any hint of the mesentery, that yellow material that was in between the intestinal folds. But, you know, I guess maybe my point is, when you see these cartoons, it could be helpful to you to think about, okay, what am I not seeing? What's missing? Or what is being oversimplified? So let's talk about food first. And then we'll talk about organs. And then we'll talk about organs and food together. So, you know, we could talk about digestion from just following what happens with protein, and what happens with carbohydrate, and what happens with fat. Or we could say what happens in the mouth, and what happens in the esophagus, and what happens in the stomach. Or we can do both. And my strategy has always been to do both. So to sort of interleave what happens with food with the pathway that the food is going through. So let's just expose an overview of what happens with the different food groups. So carbohydrate, you eat a baked potato. It's almost pure, with no butter and no bacon and nothing on it. Just a pure baked potato. It doesn't sound very good, but that's almost pure carbohydrate. You actually start to digest it in your mouth, because the salivary, when you chew it, you mix it with saliva, and the saliva contains an enzyme called amylase, which starts to break down the starch into shorter polysaccharides and monosaccharides. So amylase is one of the enzymes that breaks polysaccharides, starches, into shorter chains like oligosaccharides and sugars, monosaccharides. So we have to talk about some chemistry here, right? You know the building blocks of carbohydrate are sugars. Several sugars make a oligosaccharide, and long chains of sugars make a polysaccharide or a starch. So in your mouth, you start to digest starches with salivary amylase. Later on, after it gets out of the stomach and into the intestines, amylase is also a component of pancreatic juice. The pancreas secretes digestive juices that contain amylase. So salivary amylase in the mouth and pancreatic amylase in the small intestine break starches down into monosaccharides, and then in the small intestine there are going to be other enzymes, including lactase. So you might know that lactose is a disaccharide. It's two sugars together. And lactase breaks lactose down into galactose and glucose. And we have mechanisms for absorbing monosaccharides. And you're going to see the common theme here. Remember the glucose, the sodium glucose co-transporter in the kidney? Well, we're going to see a whole series of sodium sugar co-transporters in the small intestine to absorb sugars from food. So amylase starts the project breaking down. Other enzymes cut disaccharides into monosaccharides, and then sodium-coupled co-transporters help do the absorption of food, of monosaccharides, of sugars. So that's the story of sugar. Of course, we're going to flesh that out with more information about the mouth, and about the stomach, and about the small intestine, and about the pancreas as we go through the digestive tract. Protein. The digestion does start in the mouth because you chew that piece of meat or tofu or tempeh or whatever it is you're eating that's protein. You're chewing it, but saliva is not breaking it down chemically. So there is a mechanical breaking down in the mouth, chewing. And then, but the digestion really starts, the chemical digestion really starts in the stomach. And there's going to be an enzyme called pepsin. Pepsin is a protease. And it's going to start breaking down proteins into oligopeptides and oligopeptides and amino acids. So we're going to have pepsin in the stomach, and then there's going to be a series of pancreatic enzymes that are released from the pancreas into the small intestine, just like the amylase story, called trypsin, chymotrypsin, and carboxypeptidase that are proteases in the small intestine, coming from the pancreas, that break down proteins more into oligopeptides and amino acids. And then again, we're going to see sodium-coupled co-transporters of amino acids and some oligopeptides in the small intestine to absorb the nutrients from protein, amino acids. So these are pretty straightforward. I mean, and we'll talk a lot about the details. Fat is more complicated. So let's just walk through the story of fat. You eat a blob of butter. Butter's not pure fat. Butter has protein in it, but if I told you about pure fat, you'd start to gag. It's just like Crisco. You take a glob of Crisco and you eat it. Your mouth breaks it up mechanically but doesn't do anything enzymatically. Your stomach churns it around, and the acid might help digest the fat a little bit, but doesn't really do anything chemically. What the chemical digestion starts in the small intestines when bile from the liver injected into the stuff that's going through your intestines from the gallbladder, where the gallbladder is going to squirt bile into the chyme that is leaving the stomach and going into the small intestine. Bile is a detergent. So you know, if you're washing dishes and you're trying to wash dishes they're covered with grease, and you don't use detergent, you just move the grease around, right? You just smear the grease around. But if you squirt in some, detergent, you can start to emulsify, that's the first step, and then solubilize the grease. Well, that's what bile does. It emulsifies and solubilizes the fat in food. And then, so by breaking up the fat in food, just the way, Dove detergent, or not Dove, what is it? Palmolive, Dawn, that's what I was thinking of. Palmolive detergent is breaking up the fat on your dishes. Bile is breaking up the fat in your food. And then enzymes, pancreatic, again from the pancreas, lipase, breaks up the fat chemically. we're going to have a passive diffusion step for the absorption of fat. They're going to get resynthesized into bigger molecules inside the small intestine called chylomicrons. So they're going to get, the small intestine isn't just going to absorb them, it's going to build them into these bits, into these things. And then instead of going into the blood, which is where you expect everything to go into from the intestine, it actually goes into the lymph. So this is the first time in the whole course we've mentioned lymph as a fluid, and we're going to only talk about lymph as a fluid in digestion of fat. And then the lymph eventually drains into a vein, so it does eventually get into blood, but it goes into lymph first, whereas everything else goes into blood first. Okay, so that's the story of the three food groups, sort of big picture. We've heard about saliva, we've heard about pancreas, we've heard about small intestine and stomach. Now we're going to flesh this out. So there's a figure from your textbook that sort of elongates out the digestive tract. This one's impossible to read, so I've broken it down into a top half and a bottom half, which I've given you in the handout. I'm not giving it to you big enough to read. So again, this is the overview. Let's just overview it now. Instead of focusing on it one food group at a time, let's focus on it one organ at a time. So the mouth is going to mix food with saliva. Saliva. And saliva has both, it has enzymatic activity, amylase, and it has moistening, it has water in it, so it's going to turn the food into something that you can swallow. And it's going to mix it with some mucus. We're going to see mucus again in this section, just like mucus is going to be important for protecting the digestive tract as well as, lubricating the movement of stuff down the digestive tract. So in the mouth, you're going to chew it, you're going to break it up, you're going to mix it with some amylase, you're going to mix it with some water, you're going to mix it with some mucus, and turn it into something you can swallow. The esophagus is going to propel, not just drop the food from the mouth into the stomach, because this isn't gravity driven, this is driven by peristalsis. You'll see in a few minutes a video of peristalsis. The esophagus moves the bolus, so that there's a technical term for the thing that you swallow becomes a bolus. And it's still food, it's chewed food. So the thing you swallow is a bolus of food. The esophagus moves that bolus of food into the stomach, and it lubricates it with mucus, some more mucus. The stomach, the main job of the stomach is to pump acid into its lumen, into the inside of the stomach, and we do an acid hydrolysis step of the food in the stomach. Rob Dunn had an interesting story in the bio colloquium. He was trying to talk about why do we have we, humans, have a really acidic stomach. We have a stomach that's almost as acidic as turkey vultures and much more acidic than related species like baboons and great apes and chimpanzees. But why do we have such a acidic stomach? And there's a hypothesis out there that we have an acidic stomach in order to kill off all the bad bacteria that we used to eat when we ate pretty much rotten food. As scavengers, we ate rotten food, and rotten food has a lot of bad bacteria that we have to kill off in a acidic stomach. Chimpanzees eat pretty much fresh food. It's not rotten, so they don't need as acidic a stomach. It's an interesting hypothesis. I don't think it's completely accepted. Anyway, we have a very acidic stomach. The pH of our stomach is somewhere around 1.5 to 2 or so. That's as acidic. That's more acidic than vinegar. So, and the acid that we pump into our stomach is hydrochloric acid. So there's another name for it. Gastric acid is hydrochloric acid. And so we're going to pump acid into the stomach, and we're going to activate pepsin that the stomach secretes. And pepsin is going to start to proteolyze protein. And there's going to be some more mucus there to protect the stomach from the acid that it secretes. Okay, the pancreas is going to squirt juice. So here's the stomach. The pancreas is going to squirt digestive juice from a duct into the beginning of the small intestine. And you've already heard, what does that pancreatic juice have? It has amylase, it has proteases, more than one, and it has lipase. So the pancreatic juice is necessary for digestion of all three of the food groups: carbohydrate, protein, and fat. It also secretes bicarbonate into the small intestine to neutralize the acid that is coming from the stomach. So the stomach creates a super acidic environment, which is good for what the stomach has to do, but the intestines need a neutral environment to do what they need to do, and the pancreas neutralizes the acid with bicarbonate. Questions about the top half? Okay, the bottom half. Liver and the gallbladder make, among other things, we've got about 12 important functions the liver does. And we'll talk about a few of them. But as far as digestion is concerned, liver makes bile to solubilize fat. It helps the pancreas make bicarbonate to help neutralize the stomach acid. It pumps toxins and other things that need to be excreted out. So there's hepatic clearance, just the way we've talked about renal clearance. But we're not going to go into clearance too much because we've done that with the kidney. So the liver makes bile, bicarbonate, and gets rid of waste. You also know that the liver makes angiotensinogen. It's one of the functions. The gallbladder is a place where bile is stored between meals and concentrated. So your liver is more or less constantly pumping out bile, but it's not constantly pumping it out into the digestive tract. It's mostly pumping it into the gallbladder until it gets full, and then the liver stops pumping. But the gallbladder is the storage bulb for bile between meals. So this tube here, we'll talk about some of this plumbing. That tube here is a duct. Let me go backwards. That duct is right there, and that duct also squirts bile from the gallbladder and from the liver itself into the small intestine. The small intestine has the enzymes necessary for finishing proteolysis, right? The protease enzymes. It has the lactase and other enzymes for finishing digestion of starches. It does the job of the absorption of fat. Well, of all three. Absorbs lipid from fat. It absorbs monosaccharides from starch, and it absorbs amino acids from protein. So absorption is the main job of the small intestine. And then the large intestine, the main job of the large intestine is to reabsorb water, because all of that saliva and all of that gastric acid and all of that pancreatic juice was a lot of water that we don't want to excrete. We want to recover. And the large intestine recovers water and makes a solid waste product. And you know what that is. So that's the big picture. Any questions about, and the rest of the course almost is elaborating the details of those mechanisms. Let's talk about the layered structure of the digestive tract. We're going to see this in the stomach. We're going to see this in the small intestine. We're going to see this in the large intestine. We're going to see this through, this generic structure is going to be throughout the main pathway. It's not in the liver. It's not really in the pancreas. It's in the main pathway, stomach and intestines. It's got this stereotyped structure. So this is the lumen, so this is where the food or the chyme is, and this is the, in contact with capillaries in the blood. So this is where the food is, and this is where the blood is that is important for absorbing the nutrients. Okay? So now, the layered structure here is, we've got a layer of epithelial cells, sort of like the cells of the renal tubule, but they're different. But it's an epithelially layered, lined set of organs. We've got epithelium that are good for absorbing things. And we also have endocrine cells that are going to secrete hormone. Now, we're not going to secrete the hormone into the gut. We're going to secrete the hormone into blood, because that's what hormones do. But there are endocrine cells lining the stomach, lining the intestines. That's not where we think of the endocrine cells as being, but they're there. We also have these ducts and these sort of, they're called crypts in some areas of the digestive tract, where exocrine cells are. What's the difference between endocrine and exocrine? I've told you what endocrine is. Endocrine, it secretes hormones into blood. What does exocrine do? It secretes something into not blood. So your sweat is an exocrine gland. It secretes sweat onto the surface of the skin to help do thermal control and help feed the microbiome that's on your skin. Your exocrine cells of your digestive tract secrete things like mucus or enzymes or other juices for digestion, not into the blood, but into the lumen. So endocrine cells respond to what's in the lumen and secrete their hormone into blood. Exocrine cells respond to what's in the lumen and secrete something into the lumen. This structure is supported by an extracellular matrix called the lamina propria. And I'll just give you a heads up since you're here. All of these names are fair game for an anatomy section of the next assessment exam. So epithelium lines it, then there's a lamina propria, then there's a layer of muscle, and let's just go through the muscle. There's a layer of muscle called the muscularis mucosa, there's a layer of muscle called the circular muscle, and there's a layer of muscle called the longitudinal muscle. These muscles are important for the peristalsis of the food down the esophagus, or the peristalsis of chyme around the stomach, or down the intestines. Peristalsis, do you know what I mean by that word? Squeezing. So you've done peristalsis. When you squeeze a tube of toothpaste, you're doing peristalsis. If you squeeze it at the output end, let me just draw a picture. Toothpaste. If you squeeze it here, you don't get anything out, right? Because it goes the wrong way. If you've done it efficiently, you have squeezed it from the bottom, and then the next day you squeeze it a little bit higher, and then you squeeze it the next day and you squeeze it a little higher. If you squeeze it from the bottom up, you get toothpaste out the top, and you are doing peristalsis. You are squeezing it from bottom to top in order to get movement of the paste, the fluid, the gel, from here to here. Right? That's peristalsis. So your hands are the muscles that are doing peristalsis of a toothpaste tube. The muscle layers here are what's doing peristalsis in the digestive tract. So they do it, and you know, if you do peristalsis, if you squeeze here and here and here and here, if you just squeeze randomly, it's not a very efficient way to get toothpaste out of a tube. If you squeeze in a rational pattern, you get more toothpaste out. The stomach and the intestines have a rational pattern of squeezing in order to move the chyme, the food down the esophagus, and to move the chyme down the intestines in an efficient way. And that patterning of contraction is done by two nerve nets. So nerves control the pattern of smooth muscle contraction. So I didn't say, but these are all smooth muscles. Muscularis mucosa, circular muscle, longitudinal muscle. It's all smooth muscle. It's controlled by nervous activity in two nerve nets, which are called the submucosal nerve plexus and the myenteric nerve plexus. Those are this is the gut nervous system. You have millions of neurons in your gut to control this. So as a neurobiologist, I tend to focus on the neurons in your brain and your peripheral nervous system and your spinal cord, just because it's more interesting. But there are neuroscientists, I think it's more interesting. There are neuroscientists who study the myenteric nervous system, the gut nervous system. There are books written about it. People spend their lives studying this. And because it's an interesting thing that the nervous system controls. It controls the pattern of contraction of the smooth muscle in the gut. And it responds to hormones, and it responds to neurotransmitters, it's a whole thing. Some people talk about the gut brain, the brain of the gut that controls the digestion of the gut. It's a nervous system. So those are the main things to know about this stereotyped generic structure. We'll talk about the mucosa and the serosa as well. So just a name for the layer that lines the gut and the layer that that faces the circulatory system, the capillaries. Serosa is the name for that. Questions about this? So, is it clear that these are smooth muscle cells that have been cut in cross-section, and these are smooth muscle cells that have been cut in longitudinal section? That's what's different there. These symbols here are supposed to symbolize neurons, making billions of synaptic connections. Saliva, spit, and chewing. It's the first step of digestion. Well, I guess the first step of digestion is getting hungry and eating, right? But we're not going to talk too much about that. We're going to talk about once you put food in your mouth and you start to chew it, and you mix it with saliva. The secretion of saliva is stimulated by your nervous system. Your brain tells your salivary glands, hey, you're eating something. In fact, your brain starts to stimulate the salivary glands to secrete saliva even before you start to chew food. I could stimulate your nervous system to start salivating. All I have to do is start saying things like lunch and lasagna. You are now salivating more than you were a few minutes ago because of that stimulus. You may not notice it, but it's true. So saliva in our bodies comes from 3 salivary glands, and the names of which that's part of anatomy. We're not going to see it on the cadaver because dissecting out the face is complicated, but they're there. There's the parotid gland, parotid, around the ear. Parotid gland is right, sort of right in here. Parotid gland, sublingual gland, a gland under the tongue, and the submandibular gland, under the jawbone, under the mandible. Those are the three salivary glands. And there's, and there's more about what it does. Lubricates, mixes mucus, amylase. There is a lipase also. So there's a lingual lipase. So there's amylase for digestion of starch, and there's a lipase that's starting the ball rolling for the digestion of fat. But that doesn't really do anything until we have bile, and we don't have bile until we're in the small intestine. It's there. I don't think it's a major component of digestion. Okay, so the main point here is lubrication, amylase, and a little bit of lipase. 3 glands: parotid, submandibular, sublingual. Here is a cartoon image of a salivary gland. So the salivary gland is an epithelium. It's secreting saliva into a duct. So if we go back to the generic model here, this is a duct carrying saliva into the mouth, in this case. This is a salivary gland secreting saliva into the mouth. I don't think you have to know any of the words on this picture. I just wanted to show you the picture of a salivary gland. It's a dead end, right? It's got a dead end that secretes. We're going to see this structure again and again. An epithelium surrounding a duct, and then the duct emptying into somewhere else. In this case, the mouth. And we've got little holes, underneath our jaw, underneath our tongue, back in the back of our mouth, where the saliva comes out. This is just interest. This will not be on any test. There are some of the cells of a salivary gland secrete mostly watery saliva, and some of them secrete a mixture of watery saliva and mucus saliva. Some of them, so we have there's a slightly different proportion of watery saliva that contains amylase and mucousy saliva that contains mucus that is secreted by the different glands in the salivary, in the mouth. Not a big deal. Let's look at a video of swallowing.
Swallowing, or deglutition, is the process by which food passes from the mouth
I thought
to...
you were seeing what I was seeing, so now let me try to fix it. You're seeing what I'm seeing. Okay, you're still seeing what I'm seeing. You're still seeing what I'm seeing.
Swallowing, or deglutition, is the process by which food passes from the mouth to the stomach. This movement is controlled by the nervous system and involves both voluntary and involuntary muscle contractions.
Okay, I want to pause right there. Voluntary and involuntary. Learned and innate. You were born knowing how to swallow. You swallowed milk. You were not born knowing how to chew and manipulate food. You had to learn that. Your parents might have videos of you learning how to manipulate food in your mouth. They're hilarious, right? Because how many of you have ever seen a baby trying to work baby food for the first time. It's a mess. I mean, they make a mess. It's everywhere because they haven't got the skills yet for chewing. They don't need to chew because they don't have teeth. For just manipulating that bit of food that the mommy has, spooned into their mouth, daddy has spooned into their mouth, and how to get that into the back of their mouth and how to swallow. So when she says voluntary and involuntary, what I hear is learned and innate behavior.
Before food is swallowed, it is mechanically broken down in the mouth by chewing or mastication. The salivary glands secrete the enzymes lingual lipase and salivary amylase.
Mucus.
Salivary amylase begins the chemical breakdown of starch, carbohydrates, in the mouth. The water content of saliva helps bind particles together to form a bolus that can be swallowed. Swallowing occurs in 3 stages. The first is a voluntary phase called the buccal or oral transit phase. Here the tongue moves upwards and backwards.
The tongue moves upwards and backwards. This is part of the learning process. This is what those babies are trying to figure out. How do I move my mouth and my tongue to get that stuff into the back of my mouth?
Against the hard and soft palate, to push the bolus into the oropharynx. Next is the pharyngeal stage, in which involuntary movements push the bolus through the pharynx and into the esophagus.
Involuntary. This is what babies can do. You just put milk in a baby's mouth, and then some of it will get to the back of their mouth, and they know how to swallow.
Movement of the bolus stimulates receptors in the oropharynx, which send impulses to the deglutition center in the medulla oblongata and the lower pons of the brainstem.
The brain. Who knew?
The brain signals the soft palate and uvula to close off the nasopharynx, and the epiglottis to seal off the larynx. This prevents the bolus from entering the respiratory tract. The upper esophageal sphincter relaxes to allow the bolus to move into the esophagus.
There's our first sphincter. We're going to see more than one. This is a sphincter that relaxes to allow a bolus of food to get from the mouth into the esophagus. We're going to see several of these. Sphincter is smooth muscle. It contracts to close and it relaxes to open.
And contracts to reduce backflow into the pharynx. In the final esophageal stage, the bolus is pushed onward by peristalsis.
There it is, peristalsis, a well-organized contraction of smooth muscle, a wave of contraction that works its way down the esophagus to push that bolus of food like toothpaste from the mouth, from the top of the esophagus to the bottom of the esophagus.
A progression of involuntary wave-like contractions of the circular and longitudinal smooth muscles of the esophagus. As the bolus approaches the end of the esophagus, the lower esophageal sphincter relaxes and the bolus moves into the...
There's the second sphincter, upper and lower esophageal.
Stomach. So, in summary, food moves from the mouth through the oral pharynx of the esophagus and then into the stomach.
Okay, that's all we want to know. Let's stop. Okay, so now there's another video. This one is not a cartoon. This one is a real X-ray of someone swallowing. They're swallowing something that's radio opaque, so it shows up on the X-ray. Chewing, mastication, deglutition. I'm going to see if I can slow it down. This is now a liquid. It's still too fast. This is 1/4 speed. It's boring.
swallow, right?
Tell them well.
I know if I scroll it, I'll miss it. Here we go.
See it being squeezed by the esophageal smooth muscle down. So let's go back to the point 5. Little bits of food being peristaltically moved. Now he's going to take a radio-opaque liquid. The tongue moves it around, pushes it back, and the esophagus propels it down. I forget where this goes. We can see this from the front as well. Fluid being propelled down the esophagus. Anyway, that's what swallowing looks like. And some people have trouble swallowing. I mean, some doctors have patients who they have to help them figure out how to swallow. Let's do some clickers and then we'll be done for the day. Okay, let's do the top one. Which of the following is true about amylase? What are your answers? Yeah, A and B is the best answer. C and D are not correct. Amylase is important for the digestion of starches. Lipase in the saliva would be important for the digestion. If this question, what is true about saliva? I said, what is true about saliva? You would say it's secreted by the salivary glands. Well, no, so it's a different question. Never mind. Amylase is secreted by the salivary glands and the pancreas, and it's important for the digestion of carbohydrate, not fats or proteins. Okay, let's do the next one, which is true about pancreatic secretions. Right, you're showing me the right answers. They're all true. I didn't teach this yet, so let's just go to the answer. I taught that there is such a thing as gastric acid, but I haven't taught what gastric acid does. Well, maybe some of you might know. It's C and D. It's mostly for the digestion of protein, which depends on the activation of pepsin. What is the main function of bile? Right, B. Okay, so you learned stuff. Good. Let's do some things that you didn't learn. I'm curious about what you might know walking in, have a sense of. What volume of saliva is secreted per day by a normal adult human being? What's your guess? I didn't teach this. What's your guess? Cover your hands. I know what you guess. Most of you are guessing it right. 1 to 2 liters. You know what a liter is. Somebody, who's got a bottle here? That's more than a liter, right?
Yeah, a little more, it's 900.
Yeah, okay, so that's a liter. right? 1 to 2 of those of spit every day. That's a lot. It's a lot. A lot of water is being pumped from your mouth into your digestive tract, and that's why the large intestine needs to recover water. Otherwise, we'd be losing 1 to 2 liters of water in watery feces. Don't want to do that. Okay, what stimulates the secretion of saliva? I didn't teach this either, but I'm just curious about what you know walking in.
Just one answer?
Hmm?
Is there just one answer?
One best answer. Most of you are getting it. Best answer is B. Remember, the sympathetic nervous system is the flight and fight nervous system, and the parasympathetic nervous system is the rest and digest nervous system. So it makes sense that acetylcholine from the parasympathetic nervous system is the neurotransmitter that starts digestion going. Norepinephrine, in fact, if you're really nervous, you may have experienced the phenomenon of dry mouth. When you're really stressed and nervous, that's norepinephrine shutting down secretion of saliva. Oh, that's it. So